Hello and welcome to INE's CCI Service Provider version 5 Learning Path. Today in this course we will look at ISIS network types. Now there are two network types in ISIS, unlike OSPF which had 5 different types of network types. In ISIS there are only two. We have point-to-point and we have broadcast. Broadcast is the default network type unless you change that to point-to-point. Like OSPF, your network type must be the same for two devices to establish ISIS adjacency. So you cannot have one router having point-to-point and the second router kept as broadcast. Because as you know, in the broadcast segment, there is a DR election which is called as DIS. And in a broadcast segment, there would be a DIS election. And point-to-point, there is no DIS election. That's why the network type must be the same. Otherwise, your hellos would be discarded when two routers are running different network types. Here is the configuration for configuring or changing the network type on a Cisco router. So on an iOS XZ, the command is go to the interface and say ISIS network point-to-point. As far as the XRV is concerned, we go under the routing process, under the interface inside the routing process, and there we would change the network to point-to-point. So let's look at two routers. I will take one iOS XZ, which is router 5, and one XRV, which is XR1. And we will look at the default network types, and we'll do a debug to identify what type of a hellos the router sends when it's default, which is broadcast. So let's go and pull up our routers. So here I have router 5, and let's do a debug. As of right now, I have already pre-configured ISIS, and I believe all the routers are configured as level 2 only. So show run section router ISIS. I have all of them running level 2 only. So we should see level 2 LAN hellos because the default network type is broadcast. And if you look at my interface, gig 1.519, I really haven't configured any network type, which means that the default is going to be broadcast. We should be able to identify that with the debug or even the show ISIS neighbors. So let's do a debug. ISIS adjacency packets on gig 1.519. So here, I should see that the router 5 is basically sending a L2, which is level 2 LAN hellos, which you can see here. This basically confirms that this interface is running the default network type, which is broadcast. We can also identify this with show ISIS neighbors. So let's go back and do an unall and do a show ISIS neighbors. Here, you can see that it is a broadcast network type. The only way to identify this would be with the circuit ID. As you can see that on the link which connects router 5 and XR1, there is a DR which is called as the disk. It is R5 who is the DR, which is also known as disk. So if I go and change my network type, my hellos which would be sent would be point-to-point. And again, if I do a show ISIS neighbors, you would see that no DR or DIS would be elected in a point-to-point segment. So let's go to 5 and change my network type. So config T, interface gig 1.519, and here I would give the command ISIS network. Network would be point-to-point. As you can see, I only see one. I don't see broadcast because that's default. So all interfaces by default are broadcast segment. You have to go and change that to point-to-point. Again, the only reason why you would probably do that is, again, from convergence perspective, same like OSPF. Like when you have just two routers in a broadcast segment, there's no point keeping that as broadcast. You should change that to point-to-point so that it makes your SPF faster. Similarly, in ISIS, if you want your convergence to be faster, if you have just two routers on a segment, change the network type to point-to-point. There's no point keeping that as broadcast. Obviously, if you have more than two, then you should keep it as broadcast and not as point-to-point. But if you just have two routers, change that to point-to-point. Your convergence would be much faster. So let's change this to point now. So let me go and remove this router. We don't need that. And change this to point. The minute I change this, it's going to affect my adjacency because like I said earlier, you could not have a point-to-point and a broadcast establishing ISI's adjacency. So if I do a debug again, debug ISI's adjacency, packets on gig 1.519, you should see what hellos my routers are sending. As you can see now, earlier it was sending L2, which is level 2 LAN hellos, and now he is sending serial hellos, which basically says that it is a point-to-point segment. What am I receiving from the neighbor? I'm still receiving L2 IIH, which is basically a broadcast segment on the iOS XR. So obviously it's going to be ignored and your neighborship would basically go down because your network type is different. Let's now go to XR1 and configure my network type. So router ISIS1, go to your interface gig 0000.519, and here I would change my network type to point-to-point. Let's do a commit. Once I do a commit, you would see that the hellos which are being sent by R5 is going to be serial, and he would receive also serial, which you can see here. And this makes my neighborship come back up, which you can see here. The state is now back up, and show ISI's neighbors would show me that my neighborship is up. Is there a diselection in point-to-point? No. We can confirm that with looking at the circuit ID again. You would see the circuit ID as 00, which basically means that there was no diselection. I hope this video was informative to you, and thank you for viewing.